Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air for the 28th week of 2015. Our program is presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. Aware is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. Residents of Champaign-Urbana founded Aware just after the attacks of 9/11-2001 because they saw that the United States government would use those crimes as an excuse to continue to kill people in the Middle East, in continuation of America's long-standing attempt to control the energy resources of the region. Control, not just access, is what the U.S. has demanded since the Second World War, because control of the supply of gas and oil is an unparalleled weapon against America's economic competitors from Germany to China. The wars begun with the American invasion of Afghanistan 14 years ago continue in expanded form today under President Obama, although he tries to pretend that they're not really going on. In fact, the Obama administration is today making war in 8 countries, 2 more than George Bush: Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and the Philippines, in violation of international law, which forbids, quote, the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state without the authorization of the UN Security Council. President Obama is also sending American death squads, assassination units, we call them special operation forces, into more than 100 countries around the world, where their operations include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. And he's conducting the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, a secret series of murders by drone that have already killed thousands, including American citizens and hundreds of children. President Obama is also recklessly provoking war with Russia and Ukraine, where a U.S. proxy government has already killed thousands, more than U.S. client Israel killed in Gaza last year, and with China in the South China Sea. President Obama is in fact killing people in wars around the world, but not in the interest of the vast majority of Americans, who are taxed to pay for the wars and forced to forego government services, to the point that the U.S. is now the most unequal developed country, and is becoming more so at an increasing rate. The wars are in the interest of only a few Americans, the very rich, the 1%, who profit enormously from U.S. control of the world economy. In Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, and in Libya, the United States is playing out what may be the last bloody chapters of its attempt to dominate the energy basin of the world through terror. Washington's policy in the Arab and Muslim world has always been terror. The terror of shock and awe invasion of Iraq in 2003, the constant terrors inflicted by the 51st state, Israel, which has waged endless war against its neighbors with impunity for almost 70 years under the U.S. military and diplomatic umbrella, the totally unprovoked terror that rained NATO bombs over Libya for 7 months in 2011, allowing the dark night of jihadism and ethnic cleansing to descend on what had been Africa's most prosperous country, and then sending these jihadists to commit a similar bloodbath in Syria. The international jihadist network owes its very existence to the United States, which in a joint venture with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia spent billions creating the global infrastructure of terror with its headquarters in Afghanistan starting in the late 1970s. U.S. government, both Democrat and Republican administrations, and their Saudi Arabian clients believed they could buy the jihadist services and then discard them when no longer needed. Instead, they have created a Frankenstein, whose Islamic State component has already declared its intention to sweep away the Arab monarchies, along with U.S. control of the Middle East. Al-Qaeda, which committed the crimes of 9/11, and the U.S. are on the same side in the war in Yemen, just as they are in Syria. But of course, in the long run, their interests are irreconcilable. In the end, the jihadists, who have grown exponentially stronger, will remain a force in the region, the U.S. will be expelled, and royal Saudi heads will roll, or so suggests the estimable Glenn Ford. But Obama is willing to kill a lot of people to prevent that. He just won't tell the American people about it, while he pursues the profits of the 1%. Tonight we'll try to give a better account with commentaries by Ron Zoke, Karen Aram, Stuart Levy, and we'll begin with Ron Zoke on Fina de Sen's Zorba Dances.
Yes, I want to just bring you some points made by earlier media figures about what has gone on in Greece since the vote last Sunday, July 5th, repudiating the demands of the Troika, the lenders to Greece, and saying that apparently they would rather accept some kind of financial independence if that means being expelled from the Eurozone and giving up the euro, resorting to IOUs and going back eventually to the drachma, which many people think is a good idea, and it should have been done from the beginning rather than getting involved in the euro. So have the Greeks vindicated democracy there, and will they regard July 5th as somewhat equivalent to our July 4th in declaring their independence from these foreign creditors? They have already had, as Paul Krugman keeps pointing out, 5 years of austerity, and they're not saying they don't want it anymore, apparently, and they're willing to make some sacrifices to bring that about. So I'm very pleased that the vote went the way it did, but that should not lead to triumphalism. There should be, I think, some dances of joy, but in a few days, the reality of what has been done will hit, and there's going to be a lot of suffering ahead, I'm afraid. Unless Greece can get some relief from Russia and China, two possibilities that are frequently being bruited today, and what will happen there, I'm not sure. Will that scare the plutocrats of the European Union? I'm not sure. So the lineup has seemed to be Syriza versus the Troika that I mentioned, the European Union, the Eurozone, and the IMF. What's often left out of account is the contribution that the previous 5 years of austerity has made to the rise of the ultra-right in Greece. We're not hearing much about that from the mainstream media, but there have been pictures online of the Golden Dawn group bringing in food, feeding the pensioners in Greece, who have become kind of the object of controversy there, and pointing out that the Greeks who are getting their pensions are typically paid only enough for food that will last them through the middle of the month or the 20th or so. And the rest of the month they go hungry, and it's been a terrible situation for them. I'm not surprised that they didn't want any more of it, even though it might mean some other problems down the road. So the pictures are there if you go online and YouTube of the Syriza group, the fascist and some say neo-Nazi group in Greece, bringing in food, feeding the people. There are a lot of grateful Greeks. And
you mean Golden Dawn rather than the Syriza?
I'm sorry, yeah, the Golden Dawn bringing in the food.
That's the neo-Nazis,
yeah. And feeding the ordinary Greeks who are in a terrible condition there. So will this act of rebellion against domination by the European oligarchs have any effects longer term? It's hard to know what that is. But I'll bring you just a few words from some of the things that are available online. Paul Krugman says, will they, that is the Troika, reconsider now that the attempt to drive the governing leftist coalition from office has failed? Some see this as the secret agenda of the Troika, as trying to get rid of the leftist Syriza government in Greece and, in effect, trying to bring about regime change. At this point, Krugman says the financial crisis in Greece has already happened, so that the biggest costs of the euro exit have been paid. Why then not go for the benefits? Would Greek exit from the euro work as well as Iceland's highly successful devaluation in 2008 and 9, or Argentina's abandonment of its $1 peso, $1 policy in 2001 and 2? Maybe not, but consider the alternatives. Unless Greece receives really major debt relief, and possibly even then, leaving the euro offers the only plausible escape route from its endless economic nightmare. George Friedman, in his column, who's normally a kind of neoconservative, very much concerned with geopolitics, writes that as a result that should surprise no one, the Greeks voted to reject European demands for additional austerity measures as the price for providing funds to allow the Greek banks to operate. There are three reasons this should have been no surprise. First, the ruling coalition of the radical left, or Syriza party, is ruling because it has an understanding of the Greek mood. Second, the constant scorn and contempt that the European leadership has heaped on the prime minister and the finance minister, who just resigned apparently, convinced the Greeks not only that the scorn was meant for them, but also that anyone so despised by the European leadership wasn't all bad. Finally, and most importantly, the European leadership put the Greek voters in a position in which they had nothing to lose. The Greeks were left to choose between two forms of devastation. One was immediate but possible to recover from, and one that was a longer-term strangulation with no exit. On Common Dreams, you can find another meditation on this. Was this one of the dominoes of democracy? Is Europe about to find a new footing in popular democracy? The left finds hope in austerity, anti-austerity vote, this one says. And she brings in some notes about an Irish observer who talks about Ireland facing the same kind of dilemma early on and how they dealt with it. The German leftist party, Die Linke, stands with Syriza, and there's a good deal additional of interpretation there that you might want to look up. So 3 points, statements that I think are very good by Krugman, Deidre Fulton, the staff writer for Common Dreams, and George Friedman, whose writing I don't ordinarily endorse, but I think is making some very good points at this time. And there I'll stop.
Thank you, Ron. Greek fisherman's cap to go with the Greek fly. Is that what? Yeah. Yeah. Hey, look, no one ever said you didn't dress the part, so I appreciate it. The points you raise are extremely important. I know we all want to comment on it. I think what we'll do is continue with some comments from the rest of the panel and then come back to this. So if you want to hear Ron's points taken up again, hang around and we'll get back to them. We'll go now to Karen Aram and pivot to Asia.
Well,
with the military in tow, right?
Yes, yes. Yeah, I want to comment here briefly from TomDispatch.com and Alfred McCoy, who wrote Washington's Great Game and Why It's Failing, and then he also wrote The Geopolitics of American Global Decline, Washington versus China in the 21st Century. What is of such interest is that he traces the history of our foreign policy. And it brought to mind, Ron, when you mentioned that a particular conservative neocon you said was interested in geopolitics. I'm thinking, I think most neocons are interested in geopolitics because of the fact that the U.S. policy, foreign policy, is so based upon it.
Yeah.
And it starts with Alfred McCoy. I do recommend people read this in its entirety. I'm just going to quote a couple pieces here. He talks about, on a cold London evening in January 1904, Sir Halford Mackinder, if I'm or Kinder, I'm not sure. He was the director of the London School of Economics. He entranced an audience at the Royal Geographical Society on Savile Row with a paper boldly titled The Geographical Pivot of History. Now, he argued that the future of global power lay not, as most British then imagined, in controlling the global sea lanes, but in controlling a vast landmass he called Eurasia. And from there we go to 1946, and this article traces it. You had George Kennan, who wrote in his paper, let's see, what did he say here? Oh, in 1946, George Kennan, he was the U.S. charge of affairs in Moscow, and he wrote a long telegram with the sentence which would be published as the sources of Soviet conduct. And this was in the prestigious magazine Foreign Affairs under the pseudonym Mr. X, though everyone in Washington knew he had written it. And from that moment on, containment of what until the Sino-Soviet split was called the policy of the era. The idea was to ring the Soviet Union and China with bases, and then militarily, economically, and diplomatically hem in a gaggle of communist states from Hungary and Czechoslovakia in Eastern Europe to North Korea on the Pacific, and from Siberia south to the Central Asian SSRs of the Soviet Union. In other words, much of the Eurasian landmass. He's quoted as saying, you know, for even the greatest of empires, geography is often destiny. And then, of course, we had Henry Kissinger, and we know that his political foreign policy strategy was, at the time, I think we used to refer to it in the 70s, if I'm not mistaken, as this trilateral policy, where the U.S. had to balance the powers of Russia and China. The point being that Mackinder created it, but our government has been following it, and there are more writers on it. You have many more people following it, right up to Brzezinski. There's a big new Brzezinski, who was the foreign policy advisor to the Carter administration, and then later to the Reagan administration, and unfortunately now to the Obama administration. So every one of our presidents have been following this foreign policy of containment. It's only under the Obama administration that the pivot to Asia has become so obvious, okay, so very obvious out there. And I keep talking about China and what's been happening in the South China Sea with our provocations of China and our use of proxies, our allies, and what they call the string of pearls of containment around China. Well, China calls it the string of pearls, but we call it our containment policy. But all of this that I'm referring to, the foreign policy, that is leading up to the Pentagon's 2015 strategy for ruling the world. Okay, the Pentagon last Wednesday, I believe it was, released their report. And it's full of war, and more war. And it obviously has its basis upon the foreign policy practices that we have been following right up to present day. Now, I'm going to quote, because it's a much more detailed article than what I'm able to comment from, but an article in Counterpunch, and I highly recommend people go to Counterpunch. There's some really good stuff there. This is written by Mike Whitney, the Pentagon's 2015 strategy for ruling the world, and I quote here, I shouldn't say I quote, I paraphrase a lot of what they're saying. He refers to it as a blueprint for ruling the world through military force. And he said the determination to unilaterally pursue U.S. interest through extreme violence remains the cornerstone of the new strategy. Except, as I'm saying, is it really a new strategy? Well, I guess it's a new strategy, but it's not a new policy. War, war, and more war. And I'm quoting Mike Whitney right now. He said, "This is the Pentagon's vision of the future. Unlike Russia or China, which have a plan for an integrated EU-Asia free trade zone, or the Silk Road, that will increase employment, improve vital infrastructure, and raise living standards, the U.S. sees only death and destruction ahead. Washington has no strategy for the future, no vision of a better world. There is only war, asymmetrical war, technological war, preemptive war." And who is in the military gun sights? Okay, specifically Iran, Russia, and North Korea as aggressive threats to global peace. Now, it also mentions China, but there's kind of a dual character there and very duplicitous. And now I'm going to quote. He says, this is a direct quote from the NMS, which is the National Military Strategy. The Pentagon released, and anybody can find this online. "None of these nations are believed to be seeking direct military conflict with the United States or our allies. Nonetheless, they each pose serious security concerns, which the international community is working to collectively address by way of common policies, shared messages, and coordinated action." Then Mike Whitney goes on to comment, and he says, now did you catch that last part? "None of these nations are believed to be seeking direct military conflict with the U.S. or our allies. Nevertheless, they each pose serious security concerns." So in other words, none of these countries wants to fight the U.S., but the U.S. wants to fight them. And the U.S. feels it's justified in launching a war against these countries because, well, because they either control vast resources, have huge industrial capacity, occupy an area of the world that interests the U.S. geopolitically, or because they simply want to maintain their own sovereign independence, which of course is to us a crime. Now, the MS devotes particular attention to Russia. That's Washington's flavor of the month enemy, who had the audacity to defend its security interest following a State Department-backed coup in neighboring Ukraine. For that, Moscow must be punished. I'm going to skip most of this, but of particular concern to the U.S., this is an excerpt from the document, is the proliferation of ballistic missiles, precision strike technologies, unmanned systems, space and cyber capabilities, and weapons of mass destruction technologies designed to counter U.S. military advantages and curtail access to the global commons. Now, I like that little sentence there where it says to counter U.S. military advantages. So, you know, we cannot have we have to be in the driver's seat. We have to be in the lead. So Russia is the enemy. Therefore, Russia must be defeated. Now, they provide a laundry list of justifications for launching wars against imaginary enemies of the U.S. Whether the topic is new technologies, shifting demographics, or cultural differences, all are seen as a potential threat to U.S. interests, particularly anything related to the competition for resources. Basically, this is old wine in new bottles. And that was my point in referring to Alfred McCoy's article that shows that our goal for a very, very long time has been to control Eurasia. And that is why we have pivoted to Asia now so obviously. I also want to mention on Counterpunch, I haven't even digested it all yet, but there's an article by Robert David Steele called The National Military Strategy, Dishonest Platitudes. It was written on the 6th, which I think was yesterday. And the reason I mention that, he goes through and he really, really slams it. And by the way, he is a he's a 39-year veteran of the U.S. States Marine Corps. He was the Central CIA, and his now retired for-profit Open Source Solutions Network, Inc., and he's co-founder of the Marine Corps Intelligence Activity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when he starts talking about this Pentagon paper, and he pretty much comes out and says that it's bogus and lies, and he's furious over it. and he refers to this business of Russia aggression, you know, and it's ridiculous. We are the aggressor. So people, if you think that we're just making this stuff up, make no mistake, we are not. There are people out there who have the intelligence, who have the information, and all you have to do is go and read the Pentagon report. It's out there online.
Thank you, Karen. There's an important, very important point here, I think, that we've talked about before in other ways, and it refers to the fact that for a century, at least back to the militarization of the United States that took place in the Wilson administration before the First World War and drove pacifist people into war, for a century, the American government has been very candid about what it's actually doing and its use of military force, killing people, in order to control the world economy. It's quite candid about it in administrations running from Wilson's up to Obama's. The problem is there's a parallel narrative, the narrative about how the United States is out there protecting peace and freedom and fighting challenges to peace and freedom for the benefit of all of humanity. It's the second one we hear, but that one has been so successful that it's not prevented the American government from actually saying what it's doing, from people like George Kennan down to the present moment. And it's our job here, and sometimes to point to that other discussion, the actual discussion, the real discussion Karen was just doing, about what the United States policy really is and the ideas that guide it. They're not stupid, they're vicious, and that's different. You're watching Aware on the Air, devoted to, presented by the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana. And we'll go now to Stuart Levy.
So I'd like to say something about debt.
Can you lend me 20 until cover lunch?
So of course, yes.
Well, it's a contributor to war.
You remember the saying that was a commonplace at the time when so many Latin American countries were in enormous debt. You know, if I owe you $1,000,
yeah,
I don't sleep at night, but if I owe you $1 million, you don't sleep at night.
That's a good one.
But what we've been hearing is more of the $1,000 sort, that in talking about the debts of Greece and of other countries who are sort of waiting in line, kind of trying to see who may yet come to the point, to some point like that Greece has come to. We keep hearing, well, the only reason that these debts are there is that they were, that the people are lazy, they don't work, they don't collect taxes, they're fiscally irresponsible, all that. And the only thing you can do with the debt is to pay it, because that's what one does with debts. In respect to this, Thomas Piketty, who's written a very interesting book that if you come to Carl's house on Wednesdays.
Absolutely.
At 6, there's been a discussion group about it. He'd written this book on capital in the 21st century, and but over the course of this book, he looks at several centuries of history of capital and income and how they're connected and how labor is recompensed and all sorts of things, how all this is connected with inequality. Lots of interesting stuff. He's a good writer and he has a broad view of history, and so he applies it to this question. So there was recently an interview in a German newspaper, Die Zeit, with Piketty, and I'll read some excerpts from a translation of it. So they say of him, he sprang to fame for his treatise on wealth inequality, this Capital in the 21st Century book. On Germany's history, he says, Piketty says, when I hear the Germans say that they maintain a very moral stance about debt and strongly believe that debts must be repaid, then I think, what a huge joke. Germany is the country that has never repaid its debts. It has no standing to lecture other nations. After the war ended in 1945, Germany's debt amounted to over 200% of its GDP. 10 years later, little of that remained. Public debt was then less than 20% of GDP. Around the same time, France managed a similarly artful turnaround. We never would have managed this unbelievably fast reduction in debt through the fiscal discipline that we are now recommending today to Greece. Think about the London Debt Agreement of 1953, where 60% of German foreign debt was canceled and its internal debts were restructured. The interviewer from Die Zeit asks, many Germans believe that the Germans still have not recognized their mistakes, and many Germans believe that the Greeks still have not recognized their mistakes and want to continue their free spending ways. And Piketty responds, if we had told you Germans in the 1950s that you have not properly recognized your failures, you would still be repaying your debts. Luckily, we were more intelligent than that. You can read more on the history of German debt forgiveness in a paper from the London School of Economics, and I'll read a little bit from that later. And I think I'll pass this paper along to the Peace Discuss list. It's an interesting paper from an economist who was writing about these issues a few years ago anyhow.
We'll post it on the Aware Facebook page too, where people can find it.
Yes, that's good. So Die Zeit goes on, do you believe that we Germans are not generous enough? Piketty responds, what are you talking about? Generous?
You can imagine.
Currently,
this.
Germany is profiting from Greece as it extends loans at comparatively high interest rates. Germany, which is the largest creditor to Greece from the Eurozone nations, can borrow at very low interest rates, currently about 0.75% for 10 years. So in theory, it makes money from lending to Greece at a higher rate. Although successive rate cuts and payment deferrals on the bailout loans have made this increasingly less lucrative. And also another member of Greece's creditors, the IMF, charges an effective interest rate of 3.6% on its loans. So what does the French economist suggest to all this? Piketty responds, we need a conference on all of Europe's debts, just like after World War II. A restructuring of all debt, not only in Greece, but in several European countries, is inevitable. Just now we've lost 6 months in the completely intransparent negotiations with Athens. The Eurogroup's notion that Greece will reach a budgetary surplus of 4% of GDP and will pay back its debts within 30 or 40 years is still on the table. Allegedly, they'll reach a 1% surplus in 2015 and so on to 3.5% in 2017. This is completely ridiculous. It will never happen. Yet we could keep postponing the necessary debate until the cows come home. And if Europe doesn't forgive Greece's debt, those who want to chase Greece out of the Eurozone today will end up on the trash heap of history. I would like to read a little bit from the paper that was referred to a moment ago. The economist who'd written about this is named Albrecht Ritschl. He's at the Humboldt University in Berlin. And the paper sort of, this is a paper from London School of Economics. They say, Ritschl looked in detail at the financial assistance that was paid to Germany after the war under the Marshall Plan, in which the US gave, at the time, $17 billion, about $160 billion in today's dollars, in economic support to help rebuild European economies. He showed that while the transfers were tiny, Ritschl showed that while the transfers were tiny, the cancellation of debts was worth as much as 4 times the country's entire economic output in 1950, and laid the foundation for Germany's fast post-war recovery, as Piketty said. This positive impact, and this is important too, when you talk about, well, Germany is this successful economy, it should be a model for all the economies of Europe. It's not quite as simple as that. This positive impact was reinforced by a decision to reconstitute Germany as an economy led by exports rather than by domestic spending, as had been the dominant approach before and during the war. Germany was committed to orthodox fiscal and monetary policies, balancing the budget between revenues and spending, and using interest rates to fight inflation. This had the effect of curbing spending by German households and generating persistent trade surpluses, thus putting the country in a strong financial position. So Eve Smith of Naked Capitalism has pointed out that making itself, Germany positioning itself as an export-led economy meant that, well, if it had a trade surplus, then the other countries that it was trading with were going to have net trade deficits. And if it put itself in the position of being export-driven and not also financing the countries that it was trading with, then it was going to put them progressively in debt, which is exactly what happened. Let's see. One more bit. I'm sorry. I'm not finding the words for this here, but one of the things that happened with the debt repayment with the debt cancellation in Germany is that the amount canceled was equivalent to a full year's German GDP in 1938, in the year preceding the war. And if you use that measure now and look at Germany's current GDP, if Germany gave up a year's GDP now, as was forgiven to it in 1953, it could cancel all the debts, not only of Greece, but of all the indebted European countries, Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, as well as Greece. So anyway, so I hope you'll have some grains of salt to take the next time someone tells you that the only thing one can do with debts is just to repay them in full. It doesn't happen that way. And it certainly hasn't happened that way with Germany.
Thank you, Stuart. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about U.S. war policy, particularly as it relates to the economics of Europe and indeed the world at large these days. What we will do is go around for comments from the panel. I want to mention first though, that Stuart's reference to the Aware study group that is reading Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century is quite correct. We meet on Wednesday evenings at 6 p.m. At my residence. I'll post the address and directions on the Aware Facebook page, but people are welcome to come and discuss the book. It is an important text, probably one of the most important economic books on world economics published in the last decade, and we see all the time, as Stuart was pointing out, connections between the account that Piketty is giving of where the world economy is going and the war policy of the United States. So it's an important background story, and perhaps a good deal more than background. You're watching Aware on the Air, and what we will do now is go to each of the panelists for comments on what they've heard. You want to start, Ron?
Yes, the interview with Piketty, variously pronounced Piketty, and Piketty.
He's a Frenchman, you know.
Set off a fury in some places, contradicting him and claiming that Germany paid off all its World War II debts 3 or 4 years ago, and so on.
It did after it was, after it was cut down, right?
Yeah. Right. And so some of them were just obscene insults, but it's been a somewhat controversial position. But so far as I can see, I find what Piketty says very plausible indeed. Karen, on the historic roots of American imperial policy, back around 1900 or so, there was a book by Mahan called The Influence of Sea Power on History, which was kind of the charter of a re-emphasis upon sea power, which has been the great strength of the British Empire.
Right.
And then you bring up Mackinder, who is more interested in land-based geopolitics, apparently. And the importance of Central Asia in that, and what's called the Great Game that went on between Britain and Russia, essentially, there. And we are kind of the legatee of that in some respects. Well, other people have been pointing out, quite rightly, I think, that we should have our heads examined for ever getting involved in a land war in Asia. The vast Eurasian supercontinent is just too big and too populous for us to deal with and dominate unless we adopt, of course, the policy of complete extermination of millions of people. So someone, Bill Strutz, pointed out to me that if you look at the map carefully, you'll see that Europe, which absorbs all of our attention for the most part, is a relatively minor peninsula on the western side of the great Eurasian continent. It is huge, and we better start taking that geopolitical fact into account in laying our imperialist plans.
Well, that's what I've been saying. That's what the information that I'm relating has been saying all along. That Eurasia is, I mean, the pivot to Asia, and it has to be said Eurasia because Russia is like #1 there. There's no question. I mean, when Russia defeated Germany, okay, they should have been the reigning power. As it is, it didn't quite work out that way. But our fear of Russia has been maintained, and that's why our containment of Russia, and of course China. But we're operating differently. But I mean, China is aware of all of this, and that's why they went ahead with all the railroads and started building their new Silk Road, because they know that they could be crippled by specifically through those Malacca Straits, their shipping, their oil, everything. They could be totally crippled industrial-wise by us primarily. But maybe through our, by way of our proxy, Japan. And that is why they've been focusing on the landmass for other reasons as well. But again, to avoid being taken advantage of, I guess you should say, by way of the sea power. Yeah.
Both have really given way, I think, to emphasis on air power. But you know, the debate, as it were, between Mackinder and Mahan has kind of been mooted in that way, I think.
Well, I think, well, air power, how do we define air power? It's not just airplanes anymore. And I think the U.S. and China as well, and Russia as well, they're very well aware of that. I mean, but one could go into that, the technologies of our air power today. That's important.
Yeah, that might be worthwhile paying some attention to in terms of the current debates. I mean, I think we're right, first of all, to put this in the historical context, and the views that were presented by these scholars basically at the end of the 19th century that talked about the sort of imperial domination that Great Britain exercised in the 19th century and that the U.S. inherited pretty directly after the Second World War. And that was indeed sea-based. The alternative theory, the one Karen started with, was in conscious, I think, opposition to man's sea power in history. Mackinder's notion that the central, the title was the geographical pivot of history, and he meant by that Eurasia.
Right.
Very roughly Russia and China today, but he meant Eurasia, and it was a sense saying that, look, you can control all the sea power you want. The real question of domination in history in times to come, he writes in 1900, is who controls Central Asia. And that was seen, Central Asia, of course, to most good Westerners, is some peculiar backwater where people may have come from, you know, millennia ago, but otherwise is not particularly interesting to us. And of course, the exhortation not to get involved in a land war in Asia came from the half-mad General Douglas MacArthur, who made a bit of a hash of a land war in Asia and was making excuses. So it's the argument in that sense obscured the real American policy in the 20th century after the Second World War, although it was certainly there in terms of the planners' understanding before the war, that the U.S. needed to control the world economy, and that meant essential control of Eurasia. And in that sense, Mackinder was absolutely right, and that indeed guided U.S. policy up to the point where the U.S., before it got involved in the Second World War, was writing papers about the necessity of controlling the grand area, which included Eurasia, for the benefit of the American rich. The notion that America sort of blundered into one thing after another in the last century is simply false. American planners are not stupid. They went to good schools, they read the books, they looked at the maps, and they knew very well what they were doing, and more importantly, they knew very well whom they were working for. And that hasn't gone away, and that also connects the important point that Ron started with, what's going on in Greece. that the U.S. control of the European economy was a direct result of the Second World War and planned for by the U.S. coming out of the Second World War. The whole Cold War notion that the U.S. was defending the world against Russian aggression, which was very nicely from the Truman administration on, was nonsense. Very carefully constructed nonsense, but it had nothing to do with the real Russian threat or Soviet threat that the U.S. planners saw at the end of the war. The real Soviet threat was the idea of a society run for the benefit of the majority rather than the benefit of the few. That's what Russian communism suggested to the rest of the world, and it had to be demonized very rapidly by the United States in order to get over the attraction of a social compact that indeed worked to people's benefit. That's what we thought we were fighting for during the Second World War, right? Said Americans to their leaders at the end of the war. And the result was a generation of buying off American and even more European demands for a more just society. The U.S. world policy depended upon this sort of support, this sort of backing, and the U.S. control of the world economy by military means could work only if the propaganda regime worked too.
Without blinking for a moment, the fact that, I think it's a fact, that the Soviet Union contributed a lot to self-demonization by some of its actions.
Oh, no question about
Yes,
that.
of course.
In fact, I'd recommend, and we're talking about articles we're posting to the Facebook page for Aware. Noam Chomsky, whom we've mentioned here before, has a very important article called "The Soviet Union Against Socialism," and it talks about that punctures some of this propaganda. I'll put that up there too.
Okay, I have a couple comments. First, on the topic that we're discussing, I would like to read the last, and I apologize for having to read everything. That's the only way I can repeat. I have to repeat it. From Tom Dispatch, Alfred McCoy, I think this is quite important.
Yes.
For the first time, we actually know what's happening, and in regards to airspace. Beijing escalated its claim to exclusive control over the South China Sea, expanding Longpo Naval Base on Hainan Island for the region's first nuclear submarine facility, accelerating its dredging to create 3 new atolls that could become military airfields in the disputed Spratly Islands, and formally warning off U.S. Navy overflights. By building the infrastructure for military bases in the South China and Arabian Seas, Beijing is forging the future capacity to surgically and strategically impair U.S. military containment. Now, at the same time, they are developing plans to challenge Washington's dominion over space and cyberspace. It expects, for instance, to complete its own global satellite system by 2020, offering the first challenge to Washington's dominion over space since the U.S. launched its system of 26 defense communication satellites back in 1967. So simultaneously, Beijing is building a formidable capacity for cyber warfare. Lacking the geopolitical vision of Mackinder and his generation of British imperialists, America's current leadership has failed to grasp the significance of a radical global change underway inside the Eurasian landmass. If China succeeds in linking its rising industries to the vast natural resources of the Eurasian heartland, then quite possibly, as Sir Halford Mackinder predicted on that cold London night in 1904, the empire of the world would be in sight. Now, when I say this and when I read this, I hope some people don't misinterpret this that, oh, well, we have a reason to contain China because we need to be in fear of what they're doing. No, that's the whole point. Much of what China is doing is a reaction to what we have been doing for some time. And their military capabilities are still less, I think it's a little less than half of what ours are. Maybe that was information I received about a year ago. So, you know, all of our power is military. Their power has been industry and business and progress, et cetera, et cetera. And they just keep on plotting that way, but they are not backing down militarily either. And that's what we have to understand. Now, Andrei Vilcek, who is a writer I hold in high esteem, made a comment that when he was in Beijing, he was speaking to, I don't know whether it's a Chinese government official, I forgot now, or an academic, and he said that, oh, well, you know, if the U.S. attacks us, we won't strike the U.S. He said, we'll go after Japan, because we know that's where it's coming from. Now, Americans can sit back and say, oh, gee, that's nice. We don't have to worry then. We can just forget about this. Well, no. You know, I mean, the Chinese know very well what we're doing in rearming Japan and militarizing them. They know very well that we have all these military bases all around Asia. And remember, China, I mean, did we forgive the reparations of Japan as well as Germany after World War II?
Yes.
I believe we did, exactly. And again, there was a reason for that. So, and they've never apologized, they've never even acknowledged what they did to China. So, and any provocation on the part of Japan, I fear, will start a war. And, and we have given promises to our allies, our proxies. So I hope we don't, that's why I hope this doesn't happen. I want to make another comment on Greece, Ron. One of the things that I noted was that the vote, they say that the majority of people who voted yes were the older people on pensions, as where the majority of people who voted yes, oh, sorry, I've got it wrong, that voted no,
That's right.
I've got it backwards, were the young.
Yeah.
Because they have 23% unemployment. Boy, but I'm getting
Some
this all
people
mixed
say
up.
it's twice that.
20, yeah, at least
youth,
23% unemployment. It's probably higher than that, right?
Yeah.
Amongst
It says so.
young
Some say
people. So while they're going to suffer a lot of pain right now, it still can't compare to the pain down the road. I mean, the no vote is looking at pain, but if they were to have voted yes, it would have been a short-term solution. But they would have been so further indebted, and there would have been no, I mean, there is no future for the young people there now. So I think that it's important that we note, I mean, I was celebrating the no vote, even
Yes.
though I know how
And you
much
should.
these great Greek music out there, I posted on Facebook, even though I know that they are going to suffer terribly, especially the older people, because there's no easy solution. I do know also that Tsipras, I don't say his name correctly, I do know that he met with Russia. Russia said they weren't giving them loans or bailouts, which, as we know, would further enslave the people, because indebtedness is a form of enslavement. And I know that they were supposed to have, they said they wouldn't give them more loans, but they would give them business opportunities. And I know that they were supposed to have met with China, I think in early June or maybe even late May, but I have never gotten anything on that. So I don't know what happened. But I want to point out that another article, and this is a book written by John Perkins. It was a book of fiction. He wrote it as fiction, but it's not fiction. And it's called, it's about the Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And he worked for, well, he worked for the banks, the IMF, CIA, all of them. And here, his point is that he discusses how Greece and other Eurozone countries have become the new victims of economic hitmen. And he talks in very depth, and I really believe all of this is true since I worked for some of these organizations in the past, or related organizations. He revealed how international organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and in Greece's case it would be the ECB, I believe, and the World Bank, while publicly professing to save suffering countries and economies, instead pull a bait and switch on their governments, promising startling growth, gleaming new infrastructure projects, and a future of economic prosperity, all of which would occur if these countries borrow huge loans from these organizations. Well, these countries then have these imposed harsh austerity policies prescribed by the IMF and World Bank as solutions to the economic hardship, but in fact, what they do is they squeeze every last drop of wealth and resources from these economies and continue to do so today.
Thank you, Karen. We have a few minutes left. Stuart, if you have some comments.
Maybe a couple about
Sorry.
the wonderful McCoy article.
Yes.
So he talks about Mackinder, a couple of points that Mackinder made that I thought were especially interesting. A key that he saw to the success of a unified Eurasian continent, supercontinent, was low-cost land transport, which he saw cost of shipment as a huge gain. You know, they could ship things more cheaply than Britain could, or the Japanese shipping could by sea. And he also saw, he didn't necessarily talk about annihilation. It was sufficient just to keep the continent from unifying. And so being able to drive somehow a stake into the heart of countries that might otherwise otherwise unify, you know, to sow discord.
American policy to today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, we know that's what China now has been doing, cutting costs by building the railroad, the Silk Road, all through, along with their gas pipelines, in order to cut not just cost, but in order to prevent them from being blockaded at any point in time. Yeah.
Is this McKay, the history professor at Wisconsin?
McCoy. McCoy. Yeah.
McCoy,
Alfred
quoting
McCoy.
Right.
He's already
Yes.
talking about
Yeah.
Mackinder.
Yes.
Vilifying
He's not
Mackinder.
just some snot-nosed kid. But
No, he wrote.
definitely is not.
No, he's written several books. One of my favorites is The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. That was published in the 70s, I think.
Absolutely,
And
yes.
the CIA went to great lengths, evidently, to prevent it from being published.
Right.
And because I know that a lot of what was in it was accurate. No, he is a very detailed, methodical researcher.
You have a
That's
concluding
why-
comment, Stuart?
I don't.
I
I've
do.
started a new thread,
Carl.
but maybe there's not.
Huh?
maybe
I
it's
do.
a-
Honduras.
Okay.
Oh, good.
Yes, yes.
We need to be quick about it the same way the
Okay.
American government was.
Okay, well, Andrei Vilcek wrote an article, and basically he's very concerned. It's also on Counterpunch. He said the title of the article is Latin American Revolutions Under Attack. And Andrei points out that, you know, we think that the U.S. government has forgotten Latin America. They have not. And there is fear that there is going to be regime change or a coup in Honduras because they've been too good to their people, and the elites don't like it.
I think you're confusing Honduras and Ecuador. at
Oh,
this
I
point.
said Honduras. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I meant Ecuador. Ecuador, yes.
I think
forget-
we're getting tired here.
Yeah, I don't know
You've
anything.
been watching Aware on the Air, presented by
I'm
members
sorry.
and friends of Aware,
Ecuador,
the anti-war,
Ecuador,
anti-racism
Ecuador.
effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 28th week of 2015. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett. Thanks to him also. This program and others like it will be available on YouTube. And see the Facebook page for Aware for articles that we've referred to this evening. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and the rest, who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Zoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Aram, Michael By, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.